Hi, good afternoon. Today is September the 5th, 2025, and it's almost 1 p.m. Central Time. And I'm recording this video. Well, my name is Reynaldo Javier Aguiar Marcano. That's my full name, but I go by Reynaldo Aguiar. And I'm recording this video from my house at the 26714 Valleyside Drive, Katy, Texas 77494. And this video is part of the series Rapid Fire Tips for Law Enforcement that I've been working on for, I think, almost, let's say, 4 months now. I think this is a very interesting session that I wanted to make because it combines different areas, right? So it combines software engineering with lawfare topics, and also some historical context. So it's going to be more of a technical session, and I'm going to speak more in a way as if I was, conveying this information to law enforcement than, rather than general public or population. So I'm gonna, because I think it's information that might be more useful to those circles, right? If they ever, see this information. Yeah. So I haven't really prepared what I'm going to say, so I'm gonna kind of, do this on the fly. It's gonna be a bit bumpy, but I kind of have a list of things that I've been meaning to mention for the last week or so, and I haven't had the time to do a session like this, and they've been accumulated, right? So I have kind of a short list of things that I want to talk about, and I'll try to keep it, to stick to the list. But often happens that when I go through these paths, that I remember something that happened or something that is important, and then I say it, right? But I'll try to stick to the to the points that I thought could be that would make sense to talk in this session in that particular order. Okay. So I have a little list of talking points. Yeah, so let's start with how we got to this point, right? So the name of this session is Lawfare, and I'm going to talk about some of the tactics and things that they've been doing on the legal front, right? Because as I mentioned before, like this systematic attack has different fronts, and they execute them in parallel, right? And one of those fronts is the legal front. Okay, and this is where they use the legal system, and people connected to you directly or indirectly. It could be your partner, it could be a business partner, it could be a romantic partner, it could be the president of the homeowners association where you live. It could be, and all these are plays that they have already developed. Like, this is not, don't think that this is something that they do, on the fly. Like, they have all these plays already pre-designed, and what they do is that they pick what to use against you, right? It's a system that is standardized. Okay. And this is an interesting point. It's probably, I mean, I don't know this because I haven't seen, the inside of how they do it. But I imagine it's standardized and localized in the sense that different countries, for example, have different legislations or different legal systems, right, with different rules. So they have to localize that technology, right? So, if you're going to kidnap a child using the legal system, is different how you do it in the US versus how you would do it in Canada or versus how you would do it in Mexico, right? I mean, the arguments, the procedures, the timings, how you're going to deploy the strategy changes, right? So that is localization, really. What they're doing is localizing the legal attacks so they scale globally, right? But before we get into it, really, I think it's important to understand how we got to this point. So the situation, to give you the summary, is escalating, right? And I think I don't know yet, but it feels from my side that I have successfully developed what I call the KOL legal vaccine, meaning a systematic vaccine to repel their attacks. The same thing that I did when I developed the KOL vaccine to protect the queries, what we talked about in the last session, that I was protecting the queries and they were changing the query. Exactly the same thing, right? So we are in that dynamic right now where I have developed a systematic vaccine, and now what they're doing is changing the query. Exactly the same. It's exactly the same dynamic, but instead of Google, now it's a court in Texas, right? Instead of Google search results, now the dynamic is playing out in a court of Texas, which is very different because, and this is important to understand, I think it's a tactical mistake what they're doing, because when we did this dynamic, I mean them and me, right, 3 years ago with Google search, it's different because, well, Google is a private company. The search queries and the search logs and what happens is private for Google, right? And they have the records and they don't have to give them to anybody. So, even, they weren't committing crimes, but they were in a way protected by the shield of Google, right? Of the firewalls of Google. And when I say firewall, I don't mean necessarily software or network firewalls. I mean protections, right? Google has an army of lawyers. Right? If I wanted to, ask information from Google, like they would have stopped me, right, in my tracks in a second. But now they're doing the same thing, but in a court of law in Texas, which is very different because the motions are in the record. The timing of things is recorded with timestamps. What they say is recorded in the courtroom, transcribed. And yes, somebody told me that they may be able to modify the transcriptions of the court, of what transpires in court. But still, right? I think it's a theater that is very different and exposes them, right? Because the FBI could be watching. They don't know. I don't know, right? I don't know. They don't know, right? Maybe the FBI is watching all this that they're doing in court. Maybe the FBI is watching what the judge does, right? They don't know. So they'll have to, if they want to push it, right? If they want to push what the attack, they'll have to take the risk. And maybe the FBI is watching, maybe it's not. I don't know, right? But if it is, and they push, it could be a big mistake for Diosdado Cabello personally, right? So it's very different. It's a very different tier of operations, what we're talking about now. So that's good. I like that, right? But the reason why we are in this point this week, right, when things are escalating, on their side, they're escalating. On my side, I'm following my strategy, right? I already thought that this would happen months ago, and I prepared for this. And I'm going to explain about how I do it and what I did. But I'll do that in a minute. But the reason why we're in this situation, legally speaking, today, is because like 2 weeks ago, right? So my former partner, she stopped talking to me, and I'm going to elaborate also on why, right? Like I'm going to explain what I think is the dynamic behind her withdrawal. Like she withdrew all communication from me, right? We didn't have like really a fight, or there was no incident really, but she withdrew, and I understand. Right? I understand why, and I'll talk about that. So when she withdraws like that, right? So my reaction was to ask her if her withdrawal is going to be permanent, and she said yes, right? So after she said that, I said, well, then I probably want to move out of Katie, right? But that's the logical step for me. I mean, I'm not doing anything here that I cannot do anywhere else, right? So I bring that up, and then the next issue that I bring up is, well, you took the child, and I'm sorry for talking about these personal things, but I think it's important to understand, how we got here. You took the child without my consent, and you've had him for 160 days at that day, right? I counted the days. So what I asked was for a travel authorization so I could travel with the child for a period of 90 days, right? Not even the 160 days. but to have with him an equivalent amount of time that she had. Her response over text messages was, yes, that's fine. Let's do that. Okay. And she had me in that state, thinking that I could leave Katie for like a week. And she never gave me any indications that it was not true what she was saying. She seemed genuine, right? That she wanted to concede on that, right? And then on a Friday, which was I think last Friday, she said that she was going to talk to her attorney, Morgan Heidner. And then after she talked to the attorney, she told me that she could not do it, that she could not sign that, and that the reason was because I was insane and she was sane, and therefore, there was no discussion. She would not sign anything. So when she said that, of course, I said, well, then in that case, I'll have to push things in court because, this is, from my point of view, this is illegal, right? Like, you're depriving me from my parental rights. So that's why the situation escalated, right? So this is all their fault, the escalation, right? Because, they could have just agreed. But I understand, right? Like, they could not really agree because it would mean freeing the prisoner, right? Like, Diosdado Cabello doesn't free the prisoners. Like, it's not something that he does. So he has to push it, right? Until his last moment. He's not going to let it go. So that's where we are, right? So interestingly, right, during that week that I was in that state where I was believing that she would give me the authorization, she asked me a couple of interesting questions over text messages, right? Like, well, now that you're going to leave, can I go to the other house, or can you go to the other? Because I have these two houses, the one and the Lake Point Estates, and I have this other house. And I'm staying in this house, and so she asked me if I could go to the other house to retrieve some things for her, right? And I said, well, let's talk about the custody thing first, the travel authorization first, and then that's the most pressing issue. And of course, after we resolve that, before leaving, I'm going to go to the other house, and I'll do anything you need me to do in the other house, right? But I didn't explicitly agree to anything, but I showed that I wanted to be cooperative, right? So she said, well, okay, thanks. And then the next day, she sends me another message. Say, this was a message, I believe, designed by Morgan Heidner. And I'm going to elaborate on why and how I know this, right? So the next day said something about, I don't have the message here, and this is not a trial, right? So one word might be off, but the core idea in the message was something like, well, and are you going to finally give me back my passport before you leave? Because I don't have my passport. And, like, the message was worded, crafted, like, I would say even engineered to sound like I was withholding her passport, right? When I see the message, I know that's a legal trap, right? If I say, and then this is what they were hoping I would say, right? No, I'm not going to give you your passport. That is a crime. You cannot withhold an identity document from a person, particularly a person that you have a relationship with. That's, I don't know, it could be seen as maybe some sort of kidnapping, right? Keeping them in an area where they don't want to be. It's a crime. This is what sex traffickers and human traffickers do to their victims, right? So that's what they were hoping me to say, right? Of course, immediately, not because I knew the trap or I recognized the trap, but because I know that would be fundamentally wrong to withhold a document of identity from another person. That would be a crime, and I'm not here to commit crimes. I'm not in the network. So I immediately respond, right? No, don't worry. Of course. And I, also told her, look, if you need the passport today before I can go to the other home, apply for a new passport. I mean, you can apply it. You have the means to apply for it. You don't need me to get, and that is a passport that you abandoned in my house. I mean, yes, when I go to the house, I'll retrieve it, but I can't do that right now. So anyhow, that was a little exchange, right? But it was obvious to me that it was a play to then go and file a complaint with the police that I was withholding her identity documents or something like that. But I'm saying all this not to air laundry. I'm saying all this to explain or to convey one of the key fundamental pieces of technology of this network, okay? And I'm saying this because, I'm going through this introduction because I know that if I just say this, if I describe this technology, some people might think it's, it's far-fetched, or that it's not true, or that it's, I'm making this stuff up. So I'm going to talk about how do I know this, right? And then I'm going to elaborate on the technology. Okay. So first of all, I started suspecting it maybe a year ago because I applied data science to the problem. Okay, and the person that let me see this was Penelope Suarez. So I started noticing like a year ago, before capturing the geo index, that and again, when I'm saying this, I haven't said this in this video, but it's in the other videos. I'm a data scientist. I used to work for Google in these kind of problems, and I hold US patents that, I don't hold them. They were attributed to Google, but I'm named as the sole inventor in those patents on problems exactly like the one I'm describing. Like not the same problem, but exactly like this problem. So I'm a person that is, I would say, qualified to talk about that from a data science point of view about this. Right? I want to make that clear. Don't think I'm a crazy person making stuff up about this. So now I'm going to talk about something a little bit technical. Okay. So I'm going to talk about lexicons of humans. Okay. A lexicon, you can think of a lexicon in simple terms as all the words that you know in a language. Okay, so if you speak English, if you're an English speaker, you will know, if you're an adult that went to a certain degree of education, doesn't matter what it is, but and this is statistically measurable, right? You know a certain number of unique words, and that's your lexicon. Okay. And different people have different lexicons because they've been exposed to different environments. They went to different schools. They had different friends. All these reasons you end up having with people with different lexicons. Okay. Even people from the same city that were born and raised in the same city will have slightly different lexicons. Okay. But the lexicons is not what is so important. It's how you use your lexicon. So the frequency of occurrence of each word in your lexicon that you use, it's kind of hardwired in your brain. For example, let me give you an easy example so you can see. So you can see this, right? For me, the word right. If you notice, every time I say a sentence, I end it with right, or I don't know, 90% of the times. So if you look at the frequency of occurrence of all the words that I could potentially say in a day, the word right is going to be the #1 word in my case, because I say that word a lot. And all the other words I say individually, each word has a unique frequency of occurrence that it's unique for me, or not unique. Other individuals could have the same frequency, but that's my, I would have that probability of saying that word, right? Now, if you build the spectrum of all the words in the lexicon of a person, meaning of all the words that this person knows, you compute the frequency or the probability of that they would say that word across all the conversations that you have in writing of them, or transcriptions, or this distribution, this probability distribution, I'm not going to say it's a fingerprint. I would say it's like a footprint. Okay, I think that's the more accurate analogy I can give you. A fingerprint would identify a single individual, right? You put a fingerprint in a machine and it says, that's Ronaldo. Well, but you take a footprint from the mud, from my shoe, right? So my shoe is, I don't know what size, right? But the shape of the shoe, the brand, the size of the shoe, you take all those things, you say, well, you cannot say it's Ronaldo, but you can say that it could be Ronaldo, right? Or it could not be Ronaldo. I mean, if you find a shoe size 8, that's not Ronaldo, I mean, obviously, right? So I use this technique, and we use this technique in all the companies I've worked. I've used some flavor of this technology, right? And this is not proprietary technology of anybody. This is just pure statistics. This is what it is, right? But I've used these techniques over the years in my work in many places. So like a year ago, I started suspecting, right? Because I started noticing that Penelope, when she would talk to me on text messages, right, she would talk about topics that were very different than when we were talking in person. And not only, I mean, there were more subtle things, like not only the topics, but also the depth of the conversations was different, right? Like she seemed to have a much deeper, profound understanding of things when we talked over text messages than when we talked in person. So that led me, and I had, because we've been friends for 8 years, I had hundreds of thousands of written words from her. And I basically created a pipeline to build this distribution, right? And when then every time I got a message from her, right, I would run the message through the distribution to see if it would match. Surprise, surprise, it didn't. Most of the times it didn't match, right? So this is where I started suspecting, right? Now, after I captured, fast forward, right? I captured the GEO index, I built the spy health pipeline, and at some point I start developing informants. Naturally, this is one question that I have burning in my brain, right? Like, is this what I'm thinking is happening? To be clear, my theory at the time was, well, what they're doing is, because they have all these telecom companies, small and big, right? They control big companies, big telecom companies, like cell phone companies. They also control the smaller ones, like Consolidated Communications, or like controlled networks. Ramon Sanchez from New Jersey, right? This guy that was supposedly going to sell me the Superdome. He owns a telecom company that's like a small cell operator, right? So they have the technical capability to route messages, right? So the suspicion I had at the time was that when I was talking to Penelope, I wasn't really talking to her. They were routing the message to an agent, right? It could be, for example, Francisco Castillo, that has deep knowledge of me and my interests and my social environment when I was growing up, because I've known him for 40 years, and he replied to some of the messages, right? Depending on things like information they wanted to extract, or things like that, right? So he could reply to some of the messages, but the message will arrive to my phone as it's coming from Penelope. So I'm thinking that I'm talking to Penelope or communicating with her, but I'm in reality talking to Francisco, right? And this is kind of when I say this, it's kind of shameful, right? To say that you were tricked like this. I mean, I feel ashamed to say that with all the training I've had, Penelope and Francisco could have tricked me in this way for years, and I wasn't sure, right? I wasn't sure until the informant, I asked the question to the informant, and he confirmed, yes, this is he told me, right? At that point, I already had the suspicion that it wasn't a one-off. This is a fundamental piece of technology that they use. And I'll go into some details on how this is useful to them, okay? But anyhow, the informant told me that, yes, this is what they do, right? So that's also how I know that this is the case. So it's not, I'm not making this up. But as I was saying, right, it's kind of I feel ashamed if I think about this topic, right, to recognize that I was tricked in this way, independently who tricked me or how many times, but for years, and I didn't know, right? But I'm making the other comment to explain that this is not a one-off against Ronaldo. Like, they're doing this to all of us, right? To 98% of the population. So they have 2%, So, and there is a term in I don't know if this is a universal term. I try not to use like a slang from the US, because then if people watch this video in the future from other places, they won't understand what I'm saying. But in the US, at least, they call this in English catfish, right? It's when, I don't know if you've heard those stories, right? That somebody goes into one of those dating apps and meets somebody, and I don't know, say that it's a woman, that a guy is, interested in meeting a woman, and then in the pictures, she looks in a certain way. Then when she arrives, it's a completely different person, or vice versa. It could be a woman, and then the guy in the picture, is muscular, looks young, healthy, successful, right? And when the guy arrives to the first date, the guy is 40 years older than he looked in the picture, and I don't know, 100 pounds overweight compared to what he looked in the pictures, right? And they call this in the US catfish. So what they're doing really, the network, is catfishing all of us, right? 98% of the population. They're using 2% of the population to catfish the 98% of the population. And now you would ask the question, well, but why would they go through all this trouble to do this? Okay. So, well, the obvious example is what I was saying, right? To extract information, because in my case, right, Penelope Suarez was my friend, but she didn't really have the training, the knowledge, the depth to go into the conversations deep enough to extract the information they wanted, right? So, for example, if we were texting about the click attacks of Liana Technologies, I imagine the person on the other side would really be somebody like John Giraldo, right, who is an expert in that topic. And then he could kind of ask me questions that would lead me to say or reveal what I was doing, right? But Penelope by herself wouldn't have that depth, because she's not an engineer, she's a nurse, right? That's the most obvious one. There's another one that is a little bit more insidious, which is, and I think, and this, here I'm out of my depth. Like, this is not my field. I know nothing about this, right? But I believe this is really a bypass for built-in anthropological protections. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but hear me out. This is my theory, okay? I believe, because we're mammals, right? We humans, we are a species, and we have evolved through thousands of years. Like, we're not here randomly. And through this process of evolution, one of the key things that, and this is not only true for humans, it's true for every single species, right? One of the key things that each individual in a species has to do in their life is to make a choice on with whom to mate, right? Who is going to be the father of your children if you're a woman, or who's going to be the mother of your children if you are a man, right? This is a basic decision. Every human being, no, not every, some human beings are in the right to decide, I don't want to have children, that's fine. But the ones that do want to have children have to make that choice. And again, this is not only for humans, right? For every single species out there, every individual in the pool has to make the choice. And I believe that it's a mechanism of evolution. How do I frame this? Every individual in a species has to have a certain level or a mechanism to discern whether this is a viable mate or not. Right? It's a basic principle of operation of evolution, because otherwise the genes in the pool would mix randomly, and it will cause all sorts of disasters. Well, I guess the most obvious example of this is incest, right? There is a reason why incest is a crime. Right? Well, at least in the US, it is a crime to have intimate relations with, your sister, for example, right? What that really is a typification within the law of an evolutionary mechanism, right? Somebody say, we're going to put this in the law so nobody does this, right? Because this is not a good idea. But I mean, that's the most obvious example, right? But every individual, even if it's not a human being, even every animal, right? They decide with which individual or with which, other members of the species to mate. And this protects the species as a whole. I mean, it's an evolutionary mechanism. What I'm saying is the ability for an individual or for an animal within a pool of animals of the same species to discern with whom to mate and procreate is a mechanism of evolution that protects the species. And I believe that with this technology of the messages, they disabled that mechanism. Why I say this? Well, simple. Well, I'm going to draw from my own experience, right? I think, like, if I look back at Penelope Suarez, right, I think the conversations were like where she got me, like, where I said, this is a person that I would like to, do things with or spend time with, or I don't know. All those conversations happen over text messages, none of them in person, because she didn't have the compatibility with me to begin with, because she has different political ideas, she has different views of the world, like the thing that I was describing in the last session, right? She doesn't value education. Like, if her child doesn't want to go to university, that's fine, right? Because there's easier ways to make money. But for me, that's not fine. I mean, that for me, that would be a deal breaker. If I meet somebody with the intention of getting involved into a romantic relationship, and I hear something that resembles that they don't value the value of education, and it's better to make money with Cesaro Cabello, I would run on the other direction, right? And that on itself is the mechanism of evolution acting, right? But they disable it by using this technology of intercepting the messages and making you speak with a person that has intelligence about you and that tells you the right things. And that way, you fall in love, you think, with the agent, but you're really falling in love with Francisco, right? In this case, which is, I know it's twisted, but that's what's happening, right? So now, I think that's what's at play, right? It's a mechanism for them to disable this built-in protection we all have. So you lower your defenses and you become open, right? It's a very interesting application of technology, right? Because what they're doing, I mean, and this is more philosophical, but what they're doing really, I mean, when this is proven, and I'm sure it's going to be proven, but when this is proven, you'll see that what they're doing really is overriding the course of nature, overriding what nature would do naturally by employing technology. In this case, intercepting the messages and making you think that you are in love with this person that you would never fall in love with, right, to begin with. So, I mean, it's an interesting thought, right? Because the next thought that comes after this is, well, in that case, SMS technology, the sending text messages, is fundamentally changing the course of evolution, right? Fundamentally. Because everybody's making the wrong choice. Well, not everybody. 98% of the population are making, probably, I'm not going to say all of them, maybe, you got lucky and you got an agent, but the agent was genuine in a way, right? And I mean, yes, the agent is spying on you, but she really loves you, right? I mean, it could happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it feels like they're changing through the use of SMS technology the course of human evolution. Imagine that. I don't know. It's just a super interesting thought. But now let's stop with the philosophical applications, right? I mean, that's a practical application. It's intelligence extraction, but it has more philosophical implications throughout generations, right? If they keep doing this for 200 years, I don't want to make a joke, but it's really hard not to. If they keep doing this with the SMSs for 200 years, the world will look very different than it looks today. In 200 years, I mean, our features will be very different. Okay. But the next application is mitigation of legal risk. And that's what the technology is really strong. Well, the first obvious application is weaponization of the legal systems, right? Like what I was describing of what I suspect is probably Morgan Heibner texting me if I'm going to keep the passport from my former partner, right? If I say yes to that, they go to the police, right? And file a report that I'm withholding an identity document, and then they go and take that to court, right? And say that I'm crazy. That justifies the psychiatric evaluation and the censorship clause that they're seeking. So I'm saying all this so you can see the reason behind the action, right? Because if I only tell you the action, it's hard to see, right? But if I tell you the why are they doing this, I think it's easier to understand, right? Now I want to show you something else, okay? Now this, I don't know if you are going to even be able to see it or hear it. I don't know. It's a video, okay? So this is a video. It's in Spanish, and you probably won't. If you don't speak Spanish, it will mean nothing to you. But what I want to point out is the video ID, right? And this video is very important. It's going to become very important soon. The video is called G as in golf, X as in Zulu, 010760. And the extension is not there, but it's MP4. It's an MP4 file, okay? And I'm gonna explain why this is important, okay? So this is a video I recorded on June 30th, 2025, so 2 months ago. This was 3 days after the mediation, right? Or that wasn't really a mediation. It was a pre-mediation meeting because the mediation had not started at that point. I said, to even negotiate, I need the petitioner to give me a handwritten note, which they said no to. So there was no negotiation. And in the same meeting, David Perwin, who was the mediator, said explicitly, it makes no sense to proceed with negotiation, implying that the negotiation and the mediation had not started. So everything that was said between Perwin and me was not part of the mediation. That's my position. Okay, that's my legal position. And you're going to see why I say this, and it's important that I say this in this video. So anyhow, after that pre-mediation meeting, my former partner, she is the one in the video, and I were talking in a parking lot next to my vehicle. And my vehicle, you can see it in the YouTube channel. Like you can see it here. Like if you click on this, you can see what the vehicle looks like. So this is the Colt Mobile. When I talk about the Colt Mobile, is this vehicle over here. You see it has cameras mounted, and there's one in the hood. So this camera in the hood on the driver's side is what recorded this conversation. And she was standing less than a meter away from the camera. And you can see that she looks at the camera and everything in the video, right? So I'm saying this because it's important to understand or to state that she was aware that the camera was there. Okay, so she had no expectation of privacy on what was discussed. So anyhow, in this video, we're talking, right? I'm going to describe what happened, and I have the transcript and everything. But we're talking, and so I asked her, we're kind of making a joke, right? Like, so like I say something like, I got you with the note, right? With the note that I requested to the mediator, that David Perwin, during the pre-mediation meeting 3 days before that. And then she replies, what note? Like I described this episode in another, all this sequence in another. So I say, well, the note, the handwritten note, and she had no idea. I asked her like 5 different times, and she had no idea what node I was talking about, any request. Like, he didn't relay the request to her. And so at some point around the minute 3 of this conversation, 3:17, something around that time, I can't recall exactly the timestamp, she says this. She says, after you, because she said that she didn't know about the node, that she didn't, but then at some point, right, she sees that I'm getting, asking the same question over and over again, and then she asked me, but what node? Like, tell me what you know. So I had to tell her, right? So I said, well, I asked for this node to the mediator, and then she said, oh yes, the node, I remember. Like, like she changed, she realized that she had made a mistake, right? But then she said that, but then she didn't really elaborate. I said, well, but, and then she was evasive. She was very, very evasive. But then she said this little nugget. She said, well, and because you asked for the note, no, she said something like, after you, well, textually, right? Like, she didn't want to keep bringing up the note, but she said something like, it was something like, after you brought this up, there was nothing I could do. Nothing could be negotiated. But she says, right? But I was ready to let it go, to let go the litigation if we had reached an agreement. So I asked her, I follow up on that question, right? Immediately, I asked her. So I said, well, I'm a bit confused. Like, you're saying that if we had reached an agreement in the mediation, then there wouldn't be a need for me to get a psychiatric evaluation. And then she said, correct. And that is statement right there, right? So she is saying in a video recording that she's using the legal process to coerce a settlement. The request for a psychiatric evaluation is not because she generally believes I'm crazy or even in the best interest of the child. It's a tool, it's a weapon. It's a weapon to coerce a settlement, right? And this is going to be a fundamental piece of the legal warfare, the lawfare, in the following, I don't know, weeks or months, I don't know how long. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because, well, first, you have to realize the immense legal risk for Diosdado Cabello and for the organization, right? That she talks to me, because I have all these cameras recording all the time, and she's not Morgan Heipner, right? Like, she cannot, the reason she said that is because she didn't know the law, and she didn't understand that what she was saying was actually confessing, I would say, that they are weaponizing the legal system to coerce me into compliance. She didn't, I'm not saying that she is not intelligent. She's a very intelligent person, well, to the point that, but what I'm saying is she lacks the legal training. She doesn't have the legal training, and that makes her a weak link. Because in this video only lasts 19 minutes, I believe. Like, I don't know how long the video is, but it's a very short video. And just in this short interaction, she made this huge legal mistake that now has legal Heibner and William Kyle Adams and the rest of them against the ropes. So she poses an immense legal risk to the organization. And she's the weak link. So for that reason, they can't let her speak to me directly. They need to intercept the messages, right? So what the informant told me, he told me a little bit about the implementation of this. He told me that it's kind of a supervision system. It's not really that my messages go to Morgan Heibner. No, it's not like that. It's a supervision system. Basically, if I send a message, the message is like a triage, okay? So the message goes to an analyst that decides, is this a message that is safe for Gloria to reply or not, for my former partner to reply or not. If the analyst decides it's not safe, it gets routed to Morgan Heibner, right? And Morgan Heibner, or whoever is replying, is, and I have reasons to believe it's Morgan Heibner, because through the exchanges in the messages, I can see that this person has deep knowledge of the case and the allegations, right? So this person has to be prepared to reply fast with a spot-on, legally sound answers. And the only person that could do that, I think, could be either Morgan Heibner or Tina Simon. I mean, people that are actively working on the case, that know the motions, that know what's happening, that know the filings, right? And having a third person do this would be risky, because it would mean that they would have to give them access to all the documents, all the motions, all the things, almost in real time. Because I could text her right now asking her a question, right? And this transfer of confidential documents, legal documents, could be intercepted. So I don't think it's going to be somebody outside of that tight circle, right? But anyhow, so this is the reason. I'm giving you the reason why. The reason why they need to do this supervised triage system, is because they need to mitigate legal risk, because the person that they put in front of the target is not real and doesn't have that depth, and the target could outsmart them and could uncover something or could get evidence for a trial, right? So that's the reason why they have to do this triage. Okay? Now, the informant also told me that there's different levels of triage. So there's a level of triage in which is kind of a passive supervision, okay? And there is another level of triage in which the attorney that is passing him or herself as your romantic interest, in my case, that attorney, there's a level of triage in which the attorney gets all the messages. The person cannot even reply, right? When they see legal risk like the situation they are in right now, right? I'm mentioning this because this could be a huge opportunity for authorities, because they're implementing this triage right now. If you locate who is the person that is actually replying to the messages, and you stand next to them, you could intercept the messages in the same way they intercept the messages from anybody, right? From everybody. Because at the end, they have to route these messages through the cellular network, which is subject, maybe because he has to get to me, and I'm using a cellular SMS communication, right? So in the routing of the message itself, you can see who's replying. It's trivial to detect this. This is not that difficult. But that's the reason. So that's the reason why they have this system for impersonating people on the text messages on WhatsApp. So you think you're talking to a romantic interest, may not be the case, right? Maybe a guy in Venezuela, or might be a guy in China, or it could be anything, right? So yeah, so they're basically catfishing everybody, and that's the technology. But again, I think, I mean, the technical implementation of this is fascinating to me because I'm a technical person. But the anthropological implications of this, and the evolutionary implications, really, right? Because they're overriding the control, the psychological control mechanisms of everybody, right? And it also, of course, is a powerful tool because it allows them to kind of mix and match, right? For example, imagine that, in English, we have this it's like a slang. I don't know what to call that. It's like a saying, right? When you say your type, you have a type, right? Some people, or I would say most people, have a type. Like, for example, a certain man could prefer women that are blonde over dark hair. I don't know, or vice versa, right? It's preferences, right? So the problem they have is because they have such a small segment of the world population, only 2%, right? Their options are limited. I mean, the number of blonde agents that they have is limited, right? It's a resource that is constrained by the same principle of the 2% attack. And so, of the physically viable, right, that the target would be attracted to, of the physically viable candidates, how many of those would match the psychological profile or the values or the aspirations or whatever the target is looking for in a romantic partner, right? It reduces the probability of them finding a viable match, right? So how they solve that problem? With technology, right? As they solve every problem. By using this SMS technique or WhatsApp interception, let's call it messages interception, right? It could be any type of message. To basically impersonate a person that is, because the easiest to do is the physical, right? You can operate a person to change their physical characteristics. You can tint their hair. You can do many things, right? To make the person more appealing to the target. But you can't change the psyche. You can't change the way they talk. You can't change the way they communicate, the way they think, right? So that they solve with technology, and that increases the viability of each one of their agents. The agents become suddenly compatible with a lot more people, right? And so it's a key fundamental piece of technology. So of course, from a technical point of view, my recommendation would be, well, one thing the free world needs to do is to secure these platforms, SMS, so the impersonation doesn't work. I mean, it's a technical problem, and it's a solvable technical problem. And because I'm a technical person, I know this, right? I know that the SMS standard has been, how do I describe it? What's the word for that? I don't want to say outdated, but it hasn't evolved technologically for many years. It always takes a long time. Like, there's like 2 or 3 different versions of the protocol, and the new versions take like 7, 8, 9 years to implement by all the. I can't prove this, but I think it's by design. I mean, the reason why the protocol doesn't evolve is because it's weak by design, so they can do this, right? If the protocol had evolved, these security flaws would be mitigated, and this wouldn't be possible, right? And again, remember, they control the telecom companies. Huawei is a major manufacturer of telecom equipment. It's a fundamental piece of this network, Huawei. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the company, I have to be honest, because I pronounce it in Spanish. I don't know what would be the right, but that Chinese company that is accused of espionage everywhere, that the executives are put in jail sometimes, like that company controls large fleet of telecom equipment in many operators. So at the end, they cannot decide the rollout, right? Like, I mean, if they don't implement the new protocols, then what can the telecom company do? Are they going to change all the equipment because of that? No, right? So they could force obsolescence. I don't know how to pronounce it. They could force on the operators, on the telecom companies, a state of technological disadvantage, right? So these systems are intentionally weak in a way, right? So yeah, so I think that's a point that probably needs to be worked on. Okay, so I think I think that's a good point to close that topic. Okay. Let me close this. Okay. So now I want to talk about a topic that is it's a bit difficult to talk about. And not difficult, it's not emotional or anything, but I've had this rule for a long time, right? Where I prefer not to talk about people that are related to me and my family, right? Because it's just, I think it's, I mean, I could do it, right? I could do it and win this war faster, but I don't want to win that way. Out of principle, right? Because even, and don't get me wrong, I know that this is a war. And you see, like my son is kidnapped, right? By legal means, but he's kidnapped. So I think, maybe a reasonable individual would have already, like used all the ammunition that they have, right? But I think even in war, and I do see this as a war, but I think even in war, right? Like there's rules. There's there are even international frameworks that regulate how you carry out war. And there's a reason for that. Like, you have to have principles. Like, you have to draw the line somewhere. You cannot, unless you are an international criminal, right, a war criminal, you cannot, for example, spray mustard gas on civilians, right, or target children with viruses, right, unless you are the seven, right? But besides them, people don't do that, right? There's certain lines that you draw. And for me, that was the line that I draw from months ago, right? From the moment I captured the GeoIndex. But on the other hand, and I've been consistent with the application of this rule, right? I hope people see in the future that I've been consistent about this. I haven't broken the rule. This is my own rule, okay? But something happened. The information gave me a piece of information that I did not have. And I have to wait in my conscience whether I say it and break my rule or don't say it, right? And I've been, thinking about this for a few days. And, I think an hour ago, I decided that I'm going to say it. So I'll say it. This is not a blood relative, but I do consider her a relative, right? So this is what the informant told me, right? So this didn't start in 2005 or in 2000 even, because as my knowledge about the network and the attacks and everything has evolved, I can see the timeline of things, right? So the informant told me a few things, and they let me see that this didn't start in 1999, which is the point where I would put it, or I was putting it until last week. This started before. This started before that. The targeting of my family, right? And the reason I'm inclined to talk about this is because not so much because it's my family or it has nothing to do with that, but I think because it reframes the conflict. It could reframe, not reframe, but it could hint that the conflict, the origins of this, is not what it seems from the database. Okay, this started before the database. So yeah, I'm going to say a couple of things. So one of them is Endels Ortega. So she's married to my uncle, right? And they got married somewhere around 1990. Okay, some I don't know the exact date, but to give an idea, I was 11 years old when they got married, and like, what reason could there have been for? This wasn't personal. It wasn't targeting me, right? But so she's married to an uncle, and her brother Alfredo Ortega, who lives in Florida, and he's now a politician, right? But he was the one that ultimately executed the interview ruse. And this is described in the website. You can watch the video. So this was a ruse in which they steer me towards Florida to film an interview, an interview segment with one of those TV programs locally in Florida, to talk about some work that I did at Google. Okay, they lured me with that pretext, but the real reason was and this was confirmed by the informant. Like, the informant, I confirmed this, right? I'm not speculating that this is what they did. He told me that this is what they did. He confirmed my suspicion, right? They lured me with that pretext because who doesn't want to be on TV, right? So I did some interesting work at Google. Now, what the informant didn't know, because I asked him, because this project at Google, I worked in a doodle. A doodle is one of those logos that you see in Google's homepage. It was a doodle about a synthesizer that was interactive, right? So what happened was Ryan Gimmick at Google invited me. He came to my desk asking me to help. I mean, those projects are high. You know, many people want to work on those projects, and he came to offer me that at my desk. I didn't ask for it. And then we did that very quickly. It took like a week, that doodle. And after I did it, I got interviewed by a newspaper in Venezuela, and Alfredo Ortega offered me to do that interview in Florida. And I said yes, and I went there. And the goal, confirmed by the informant, was so I would leave the laptop in the room of the hotel, because when I went there, Endels, who lives there, Endels Ortega, she didn't offer me to stay at their home, which would be the natural thing to do. I mean, if they came here, I would offer them to stay at my home, because, you know, we're family, right? She didn't offer me that. She asked me to book a hotel. I thought it was weird, but now I understand, right? The reason is if I had stayed at their home, and, you know, the network to the computer, it would implicate the home, right? They couldn't do that. So, you know, the reason was so I would leave the computer in the hotel, and when I went to film the interview, I would not take the computer with me because I wouldn't have where to put it. And I knew that it had high intellectual property value code of Google. Cannot be leaving that computer in a locker. They knew that I was going to leave the computer locked in the safe of the hotel room, which of course they opened it, right? Because they own the hotel. So that's what happened, right? So that and you know, that's an important event because it was Google's proprietary code. Okay. So anyhow, the informant told me, what the informant told me specifically was that, you know, the Endels is in it. And that my car, when I was in university, was compromised. Imagine that. That car was bought in 1996, right? And it was bought by my uncle. And again, like at that point, I started university I was very young. I was so when I got the admission letter for the university, I was 15 years old. And then I had my 16th birthday on February, and then I started university in August of that year. So I was only 16. I could not drive, right? But he bought me a car because I could not legally buy a car myself, and he parked it, but I couldn't drive it, right? Well, and the apartment building where we bought the car, because I went to see the car, that apartment building is heavily marked in the geo index. So you see, this is I'm not talking about me, right? I'm talking about what this does to my understanding of this network. Because it means the geo index predates PayPal. I mean, PayPal didn't exist in 1996. So, you know, and of course, the informant doesn't know, right, this question that I'm going to ask. But the immediate question is, okay, so then, I mean, the working theory could shift to, well, maybe what happened was that they already had the basis of the technology, right? I mean, the tracking with, I mean, databases have existed for 30 years, right? So maybe, right, they had, well, there's also the explanation that they put this building in the database in 2005, long after I had acquired the vehicle, right? But importantly, the house where I lived in Caracas as I was going to university, as I was attending university, is also marked in the index. So the house where I lived, my house in Caracas, is marked, and the car is marked. I mean, where I bought the car, that building, right? The informant went on to tell me that Marlene, who was my girlfriend in university, was an agent. So I don't know. Of course, these things are impossible to verify for me because I lost all contact with I think her name was Marlene Hernandez with H. I lost all contact with her many years ago, right? I don't know. But what happened between us does seem consistent with things that I've seen in other relationships, right? I see the mechanisms, right, and how she was extracted, right, if she was really an agent. So it's possible that it's true. So I'm offering this as a tip for law enforcement, really. Check that out. But anyhow, back to Alfredo Ortega. I've known that Alfredo is an agent to the point that he's in the cover of the book. Like, he is in the cover, right, in a very prominent spot. He is in the cover and cover. But I draw the line at Alfredo because, well, Alfredo is not my family, right? And I knew, right, Endels, because she, even when I developed Cold Health in 2019, more or less, well, I mean, I developed it before, but around 2019, she volunteered to be a salesperson for my company, and she was supposedly going to certain dentist offices in Florida to leave my card and to kind of show the dentist my website. That's what she told. But I understand that. What she was really doing was, so it's a sad, it's a sad situation, like it's really a sad situation to see these things so close, right? And I truly hope that very few people have to go through this experience, because it's really, it changes you. It really does. So that's the information to look at, right? Another thing, because after he dropped that bombshell, after, like, the next day, I asked some follow-up questions, right? And I cannot get into the details because he told me, right, that it could be dangerous for certain people. Like, in fact, like, he told me that I should not have said something recently that I said, and it's true. Like, I didn't say it at that moment, but I can see the point, right? Like, I think it was, I don't know, it was last week, this week, right? The last few days, I made a comment online speculating that maybe he had flipped William Kyle Adams. I don't know, like, he didn't tell me if he flipped him or not, but I speculated, right? And then the informant, he kind of told me, like, look, I'm not going to tell you, right? But imagine that it's the case. Diosdado could kill him. And even if it's not the case, right? So it's, I mean, not the case that he's flipped him, right? He's an agent, right? And I mean, if he's working for a criminal network and the network he's working for kills him, that's not my fault. But like, it's also not, it's not a situation that I'm looking to create, right? So I have to be careful with these things. But well, when I asked the follow-up questions, that I'm not going to really tell exactly what they were, the informant told me a couple of things that seem to suggest, and this I'm offering as a tip, okay? It's a tip. If this is not, I haven't verified this, take it with a grain of salt, but if you are an investigative authority, please take this as a tip, right? And if you see that it could have merit, So what he told me suggests that the historical reason, I mean, this is a conclusion that I made from what he said, okay? that the historical reasons, the historical origins of this network really is rooted on the oil industry, on the oil companies, on the big oil companies. And the working theory that I'm going to offer as a tip, okay, is that maybe what happened was that in the 90s, when, Diosdado Cabello and Hugo Chavez and all of them were doing the attempts to, the coup d'etat that they didn't, it was an attempted coup d'etat, it wasn't really a coup d'etat, on 92. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the conclusion could be that the collusion started because one question that I ask myself is, okay, how did all these individuals, well, not all, but how did the leaders of this organization came together in the first place? I mean, I understand that they are prominent political figures, right, and prominent business people, but is it that one day somebody had the idea, I'm going to create a meeting and let's conquer the world? I mean, is that what happened? It's an interesting question, like how this got kickstarted. The working theory is that the control over the oil resources of some governments that are, controlled by this network gave them leverage over the big oil companies, negotiating leverage, okay? And they asked in return for permissions to drill, permissions to exploit resources. They asked for a little help. And the little help was, again, this is a theory, right? The little help was to help them by letting them use their companies as fronts, right? To create identities, jobs, visas, residential areas, right? Develop things. And that would explain why Houston is such a prominent hub in this network and why Calgary is such a prominent hub in this network, right? Because the root of this is the oil industry, really. And well, who controls the oil industry, right? China, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, which are the big players in this. The only big player that is missing from that is Cuba, right? So the working theory is that was the kick-starting point, right? Because they had already had a working relationship. I mean, the big oil companies and people like Diosdado Cabello, right? Who was now in the early 2000s in control of the oil fields in Venezuela, which are all owned by the government. In Venezuela, the oil resources is not like Texas. I think in Texas, there's some places where if you find oil in your property, it's yours, right? Like that kind of thing. In Venezuela, that doesn't exist. If you find oil in your property, it belongs to the government. So they have control of all these immense resources. Venezuela is the third, or I don't know, third or fifth. I don't know. It changes, right? Like what they say, but it's one of the top countries in terms of oil reserves in the world. So if you have control over these huge reserves and you have a group of companies, US-based companies, UK-based companies that want to exploit those resources, you have leverage, right? And then you can form that alliance. And I guess the turning point, I mean, obviously, if that's what happened, right, then the logical conclusion is to think that the involvement of the PayPal mafia was to empower that pre-existing alliance, right, with technology, like to provide the technological infrastructure to be able to systematize all of this, right? So it's all automated. Because otherwise, an operation of this scale involving 2% of the world population is impossible to manage if you don't use technology. So that's why they needed the PayPal map, right? So it completely reframes the conflict. Yes. So Yes. So I still have a few topics to go through. Okay. But what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna cut this video in this part, and I'm gonna create another video, a separate video, and then I'll join them together. Okay. This is just to keep the sizes of the videos manageable, so I can edit them and so it's not too complicated. So anyhow, well, thank you so much for bearing with me through this part. I have a couple of topics that are lighter. I mean, not so heavily charged, and they're fun. I think they would be fun topics to talk about. So I'll do those immediately after, in 10 minutes or so. Thank you so much.